Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. It's Maria Sanchez-Keene from the Center for Organizational Effectiveness. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for the first of our webinar series called Fundamentals and Practical Leadership for New and Emerging Leaders. This webinar will be focused on leadership in the time of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we are at capacity now, so we may need to run this webinar again. Let me just start. Sorry, lots of people still wanting to attend. We will need to run the webinar again. Different ways to participate. For today, we will have the question box, which will be monitored. We have audio, polls. The lines are muted, but if you raise your hand, we will unmute. We will be using polls everywhere, and I will talk a little bit about how that happens in a moment. And you can participate as you can. We understand that these times are somewhat difficult for some of us, so it may be hard for you. So please participate as you would like in the questions that we ask of you today. I want to just run our panel. You probably have done GoToWebinar now many times, or something similar, given that so many of us are working virtually. So what you will see in your panel, just a few things. You will be muted again. Just a reminder that there is a handout. I'll be talking about how to use that handout in a moment. I'll be asking you to click on that handout so that you can participate in the questions that we will be asking, and I will guide you through that as we get to that point. Just a few things as a reminder. The Center for Organizational Effectiveness has been in place for about 20 years, and we have some of our teammates with us today. So Carrie Selkirk will be co-presenting with me, and we also have Kathleen Strauss, who is our Communications and Research Associate, and she will be monitoring the questions and passing the key questions on to us. We may not be able to get all the questions answered. We have over 100 participants with us this morning, but know that we will go through them, and if we need to, we will be passing on an FAQ to everybody as we go forward. So this session. So as you know, we are in unprecedented times in terms of COVID-19. This is a time for us to share how this has been for you. We have gathered leaders from a variety of sectors. We are fortunate to work with many different sectors. At this time, in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, we have clients that we are working with in terms of mental health, addiction, children's mental health, youth justice, primary care, children's AIDS, employment. So many different sectors that have been impacted by this, as all of us know. And we felt that it would be really important to hold a container in which we as leaders could think about this time, about what is required as leaders and what it is that we can do together to support the staff members that we work with, as well as, of course, the clients that are a part of our day-to-day lives. So the content of our workshop, we have a lot of topics to cover. We see these as areas of competencies that leaders require in this time of crisis. We have done significant research in terms of looking at UN material with respect to emergencies and crisis, as well as many different resources that are out there right now. So we hope to bring to you a toolkit, an opportunity for you to see and comb through materials that might be valuable to you as you go through this, whatever that looks like for you. So for some of you who are in this webinar, it means that you are still supporting individuals on the front line, that you are with them regularly. I'm thinking about those who are in housing, in primary care. It may be that you are supporting individuals but are doing it virtually, and that work looks different for you, but it is essential and critical. Sadly, for some of our clients, it has meant layoffs for their people. These are daycare providers at times who have not been able to continue with their work and are laid off. So many of us are in different capacities doing the work that we can as leaders, and we will be speaking about it from that massive continuum of how we're supporting people, whether that is in frontline work where our people are nervous and scared of containing and capturing the virus, to people who are working virtually and everything in between. We know that this workshop has been created for new and emerging leaders, but we're also aware that there might be seasoned leaders that are with us today. So we hope that this might be affirming for you, and it might also give you some ideas of what might be helpful for you as we move forward. So it is important that we start with having an understanding of a little bit about you as the participants so that we have a sense of who is here. And so what I'd like to do is, this is a time for you to open up your handout. So on your console, you should see a little thing that says handout. And there, if you open that up, it looks like this. And what you do is you click anywhere actually on the sheet, and it will take you to polls everywhere. And there you will answer a simple question to start. And once you answer the question, and I'll ask you to minimize that, minimize it, and then we'll be able to see the responses of the group so that we have a sense of it. So answer the question, and many of you have already started doing that. So I'll give you a moment to be able to answer, and then once you've answered, if you want to just move back to the window that has the meeting on it, or minimize that, whichever works for you. If you have two screens, you can move the GoToWebinar browser to another screen, and then you can see the results there. Okay, so at this point, hopefully you are seeing the results. We'll just wait a moment. Okay, so we see that we have a variety of sectors with us. Children's mental health is well represented, community support services, employment, housing and homelessness, justice, mental health and addictions, and primary care. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for responding to the question. We're going to move to the second question again, just to give us a sense of who we are as we gather. So the second question again will be up in your handout in a moment. So the question is, just so that we have an idea, how long have you been in formal leadership positions? So you would just click on the one that is accurate for you. Okay, so we seem to have a good cross-section of individuals, those who aspire to be in leadership. And so I hope this is helpful for you as you think about how you could be supportive to your leadership, as well as people who have been in it for more than 10 years. So welcome again to everybody. And so just one final question as we start. So we have an idea of how this has impacted you as an organization. So what best describes the biggest impact of COVID-19 so far for your organization? I'll give you a moment to start that. Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. So we see that most of us are working virtually or remotely, although we do have a good number of people who are also providing support to clients on site. So thank you for that. It gives us an idea of who's with us. Okay, so if you are able to, I'll ask you to go return back to the screen that has, right now you're seeing our logo. And we can go from there. So the first competency that we want to talk about is leaders reflect. So this is our context, an ever-changing context of the reality of this crisis. We found a video by Dr. Beeson that we would like to show you as a starting context to our work. Now, it does come from a healthcare perspective. So I invite you as you listen to it to change the word patient to client and to think about your own reality. It's really important for us who work with vulnerable individuals like all of you do to understand how critical your work is, how essential it is for us not to forget the most vulnerable in our communities. And so I'm so grateful that you are there and that in many ways it is the work that you are doing day to day that will assist the people in the hospitals to ensure that they're receiving the individuals that need to be there. Your work is critical, and in light of that, we thought that this video might help us to put it into context. I will also say that we tried just putting the video on, and it is Dr. Beeson speaking, and it cut in and out because of the number of people that are using online and virtual connectivity right now. So I'm going to show you a picture of it while we hear him speak. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. And
Hey everybody, my name is Stephen Beeson, family medicine physician and founder of the Clinician Experience Project. I hope you're hanging in there. Welcome to the COVID-19 series on team care. This tip is for you, the healthcare team, as we go through one of the greatest care delivery tests ever. The purpose of this tip is to help you take 3 simple steps to help you sustain your care team as we enter an incredibly challenging time. There is no doubt that we're seeing a rise of care team anxiety, worry, and fear with the spread of COVID-19, with concurrent shortages in personal protection equipment, hospital beds, and ventilators. With all this happening and the uncertainty on how wide and far this is all going to go, we need our care teams to be at their very, very best. As we help build skills to help care team members, this tip is about surviving this all together. So there's 3 things to reflect on. Number 1, you are not alone. Whatever fear and anxiety you have, I can guarantee you that fear is shared by almost everybody else. And confessing and articulating and conveying that fear with your team around to say, you know what, I'm afraid of my exposure risk and bringing this home to my family. It's something all care team members are experiencing right now. So finding a time in a meeting or during a huddle to share your concerns. You will find others right beside you will be nodding their heads. Just the notion of going through really hard times and experiencing these things together can help. When we hear from our teammates, you know what, I'm afraid too, we're going to get through this together, can be immensely therapeutic. And number 2, finding meaning in all of this. We joined healthcare to help others and to make a meaningful impact with patients who come to us for care. None of those things have changed under these circumstances. Whatever is going to happen outside of us is still going to happen. Our choice is in the meaning we make of it. As our care burden increases, the meaning of our work may be challenged and be replaced with, oh my God, we're never going to get through this. I'm exhausted. I'm wiped out. This is too much. Or another response might emerge that says, I will show up fully and serve our awesome tribe and our patients the best I can. This is really hard, but we are in this together and we will get through this together. Telling stories of patient gratitude and recovery to remind you and others of the incredible impact that you're making. Number 3, check in on each other. All of your teammates have a different response to the circumstances around them. Some are dialed in and doing care delivery as they always have done. Others are disconnected through anxiety and fear. Take a moment to check on a teammate. How are you holding up? Create safety for anybody to say, you know what, this sucks. Or patients are really appreciative and the team here has been awesome. The act of checking in and being checked in on feels really good and creates a connectedness of team members that can make this grueling hard work a little bit better. So 3 simple actions to help you and your team. Number 1, you are not alone in your fear and find a chance to share that across your team. Number 2, finding and choosing meaning in this chaos. And number 3, check in on each other. We know this is hard and it's going to take us to be our very best to get through it all at the very time when it's the hardest to do so.
okay, So hopefully that sets the tone for the work that we're going to be doing today in terms of the roles of leaders. The first competency, leaders reflect. Leaders take time to think about what is happening. So the competency is ability to self-reflect, to work on self-awareness, think about what you're learning, find meaning and purpose amidst the chaos, and encourage others to do the same. This is an incredibly important competency in order to continue to reflect and think about the work that you're doing as a leader and the work that your team is doing. So what can leaders do? So this is about pausing for a few minutes with your team. As Dr. Beeson said, just a moment to think about how is this for you? And we typically think about this in terms of checking in and checking out, even in meetings when the pace is really fast and there's so many decisions to be made. Pause. Take a moment to think about your humanity and to ask yourself, what is this doing? So how are you coming to the meeting today is a good question. What is this like for you? Checking out as you finish, how are you leaving our meeting today? And what do you need to move forward? One of the things that's been clear to us as we've been speaking to leaders across the different sectors is the reality that so many of us carry such varied backgrounds in who we are and what we bring to our work. And this type of a situation can really bring that to the forefront. We've heard of people who are having flashbacks to times of war. We don't know the situation that people are facing even as they're working from home. It is so important for us to be there for one another and to do simple acts to check in to see how we are doing. And so we'd like to model that for you in terms of thinking about how we might be able to do this virtually with teams, even when there's 100 people here. So the question is, the polls that, again, going back to the handout of your polls, let me just put the next question up for you. A second. So many technologies going on for me here. So the question is, let me just put it up. And again, feel free to answer as is important and valuable to you. What words would capture what this has been like for you as a leader? And this just can be a free text that you can type in. And again, we'll capture these learnings and theme them so that we have them. So thank you to those who are responding. And we'll just take a moment to watch as people are responding. So once you've responded from your handout sheet or from your browser, I'll ask you to come back to the window of the meeting and you will see how people are responding now. Hmm. Hmm. Thank you, everybody. So as we see the responses, so many of us are feeling so many similar things. And one of the things that we want to talk today about is another competency with respect to recharging and really being aware of what we need in order to outstand this situation that we find ourselves in. I'm going to ask just one more question and then we'll go back to the competency work at this time. So this question, through this crisis, as a leader, what has had real meaning for you? Hmm. Good. So many good suggestions are coming back in terms of team and connection. Almost the things that help us with what we're feeling, the first question. Thank you, everybody. We will have that information and what came up as we think about the materials after the webinar. Okay, so we go back to our screen in terms of the meeting, and we think about this next element of it, which is the competency of leaders recharging. So really thinking about ways in which we are going to hold ourselves healthy as we go through this process as leaders. So the competency, develop self-care and coping mechanisms. Practice self-compassion. Think about how you are with others and how that same needs to be with you. Finding coping mechanisms. So this is from the UN. Your first step should be to examine your current coping mechanism and determine which are effective and which are not, and what you might do to increase the helpful ones. So just a bit of context here, because I think some of us could be kind of down on ourselves because we haven't been able to keep the routines that we normally do. And I think what we need to be thinking about is there's nothing normal about this time. It doesn't make sense that we would be able to keep the routines that we've been able to keep. And so I want to talk about self-care from the perspective of where we are and where we were even just a couple of weeks or 3 weeks ago. And what I called 3 weeks ago, pre-COVID, and how it hit our communities is ordinary time. So if we think about it from the perspective of a lake and the waters in a lake and us swimming in those waters, ordinary time doesn't mean that there aren't waves and it isn't choppy and there aren't hard things. But in ordinary time, we are used to these things. And so practicing self-care and giving some examples that are there on your screen might be helpful, but may not work during this time. And so the competency here is trying to understand the types of things that might help you within the context that we are living right now, and helping team members understand what it is that helps them in a time when we're coping. So this is self-care, but it's focused on coping. And so what the image might look like, if we think about it from the perspective of a lake and where we might have a good rhythm of how we might swim in that lake, for example, is this. These are extraordinary times. It's a crisis. So everything sometimes that worked in ordinary time may not be what pulls us through at this time. These are choppy waters. There's waves coming in every direction. We don't know how to put one foot in front of the other almost. We make a plan in our organizations, and then within 12 or 24 hours, we have to rethink that plan because of changes and directives that have been given to us. These are choppy waters. And all I can say is that in these waters, it's float when you can. So imagine yourself, you've gone from doing a front stroke to a doggy paddle, and now it's like just float when you can, just breathe up and try to take the air as you can in these moments that are so difficult. And so some really important lessons in terms of what self-care looks like in crisis, and while using coping mechanisms in the short term to get us through this. So you need to consider your stressors. And in fact, in a situation of crisis that we find ourselves in, there are 4 areas of stressors. There are the environmental stressors. So the spread of the virus, what's that looking like? What is that doing to me to see what is happening, depending on who you're working with and dealing with? The organizational stressors, the impact of this on your operation, the shortages, the working of long hours, the constant change and chaos that so many of you mentioned right at the beginning, the difficulty with understanding what the process is, and the lack of direction just because we're in this together for the first time with ever-changing circumstances. So those are environmental stressors. For us to just be able to name that and say, yeah, that stresses me. It isn't just information I'm hearing. I am personally impacted by that information. The environmental, the organizational stressors, and then your personal stressors. So as I mentioned, many of us carry things that might be triggering for us in these situations. Understand that in yourself. There are cultural differences with how we deal with this. There are differences in who we are living with day to day, where our family members are, what others are experiencing, the financial stress that we might be having at home. These are personal stressors. We need to take those into account as well. And then there are political stressors, the decisions that are made on our behalf, whether we agree with them or not. They are things that are impacting us on a regular basis. And so sometimes in a coping situation, it's just helpful for us to have an understanding, where are my stressors coming from? How am I dealing with this information that sometimes is coming at me and I have no ability to influence it, but it is impacting me? And so we think about it as the goal through a crisis is to manage the stress. You can't get rid of it. We can't. So we need to manage it. And in many ways, inoculate ourselves so that we have a protective factor around us that will hold us up in this time until we move past this situation. But that looks different than what it looks like in ordinary times. And it's coming to an understanding of what that might be for us in this time when we are coping, that we need to take care of ourselves with that and then pass this information on to the people on your teams and that you're working with. So they act as a protective factor under extreme stress. And this is a way of inoculating ourselves or being able to breathe through those moments. And so what we talk about in that situation, and again, so much of this comes from the UN materials that we've been fortunate to read, it is about immediate coping strategies. And they fall under two key categories. The first one is problem-focused coping. So this is what you've been doing all along, I'm sure, so many of you, is what's the problem? How do I break it into small chunks and how do I deal with it? So it is this question of, I'm not going to swim through this entire lake. I don't even know if I can get through and the next piece of it, but I'm going to try to do what I can to manage it. So what can I do right now within what I can influence and do the piece that I can to make this situation better? So problem-focused coping, and then emotion-focused coping. And so again, it might be that before we went on long runs or we were able to get together with friends regularly, and those were the things that really brought life to us and really helped us to decompress. And they may not be at our fingertips. And so the strategy changes and it moves to a coping mechanism, a way for us to think about now these short strokes, and floating. Just taking a moment to float and breathe out before you have to get back into it again. And so these might be key relaxation techniques. Breathing, thinking about how am I breathing through this? Mindful regulation, emotional regulation, exercise, even if it's just a few minutes that we are able to stretch or take a moment to just walk outside our backyard and come back in. What are we doing with our anger? How are we managing that? And what distractions that are productive are we able to use? How much time are we spending overwhelmed by the information about COVID-19? Can we take a break just so that we can recenter? So it looks different during this time, and we need to be mindful of that so that we can help ourselves and we can help others as we go through this. And hopefully past the immediate crisis, and who knows when that is for us, whether that is now that we've gotten our systems together and now we can kind of move past that. I know for some organizations that's not coming. They think they have a system together and then they have to change it again, or they're scenario planning in such a way that they're working with half their staff, or some people are getting ill or people aren't showing up for work. So it's not the past the immediate crisis, but when you get to it, and that might mean a weekend away. I had a client who I was working with, and she was saying that the provincial team wanted to work over the weekend to continue their planning. And someone wisely said, no, we need a breather. We need to take 2 days to recharge and we'll come back to it on Monday. How are we doing that for ourselves and for our team? So we've offered, I'm not going to go through them all, but we've offered some examples here of how it is that you can recharge after. So it might be that you're floating for a bit and now you're able to find a bit more of an oasis. What does that look like for you? So that you can take a longer stretch even within this COVID-19 reality. So I'm going to ask just one more question here just to get your sense of where we're going. So things that you can do as a leader. Sorry, I'll do this part first. Educate staff about this so that they have an understanding of how it is that they can cope and inoculate themselves from the stress. Model good practices in terms of self-care in light of this, and then do what you can to protect your staff from organizational and political stressors where it's possible. So the question is, and again, you'll go back to your browser or to your handout, and just quickly, so we capture some learnings from one another in terms of how you're working through this. What is the image or symbol, maybe a mantra, that will help you to cope and recharge? And again, we'll just give people a moment to respond to that, and we'll continue. Yes. Yes. Thank you. This too shall pass. Close that. We'll go back to our screen to continue with a few more topics, and then I'll pass it to Carrie. Okay, so leader support, we've talked about that a bit in terms of recharging. I won't read this, but you will have it available to you. It is a really good example of the types of things that are available to you to support your staff. It comes from Eugene Dufour, and it speaks about the HIV/AIDS crisis and the learnings from that. One key thing that Eugene talks about is the importance of just letting the emotions come and not holding or suppressing those for your team and for you. So what does it look like? If you're weeping, just cry and just let those emotions out so that you can continue to move forward. So I invite you to read this at some time so that you have an opportunity to get some examples from other crises that people have faced and how it is that they can work through them. So the competency, create a culture of support and connect often with your staff and team. Certainly we saw that as you checked in as being so critical in terms of connectedness, even if it's virtual. A reminder of what Dr. Beeson talked about, you're not alone, find meaning in all of this and check in with each other. I've listed here some warning signs of staff stress that we invite you to think about. How are your staff coping? What is it that they might need? What are the things that you need to be looking out for to ensure that your staff are well through this? So checking in with them and making sure that you're aware of some of these warning signs of staff stress. Again, there as a resource for you in the PowerPoint. So in addition to the elements that Dr. Beeson talked about, you need to be thinking about monitoring and addressing early warning signs by supporting your staff, modeling good habits, training staff to think about their warning signs and their reactions to it, understanding the impact of prolonged and intense crisis with respect to burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma, and understanding the resources that you might have available in order to address these. Seeking help, of course, and then having the resources available for your team. This is another element of what you can do. Emotions are catching. When leaders are optimistic or resilient in the face of challenges, staff will be motivated. When leaders are distraught or worried, staff will experience similar feelings. Your staff will take cues from your facial expressions. When leaders smile, staff will follow suit. This has been referred to as emotional contagion. Leaders who convey that somehow they will get through this difficult or crisis situation and remain hopeful during the most distressing events can transmit this attitude to their staff, thereby fostering staff resilience. Bear in mind, however, that overconfidence and bravado are not helpful. In fact, leaders who display humility have a positive impact on staff. Certainly, again, from some of the elements that you have shared, this too shall pass, we're in this together, are the kinds of messages that are so important. And just for you to be kind of affirmed by the fact that if this is the stance that you're taking, that it is the right stance. Not that we want to fake it or not tell people what the information is, but really checking in with one another and checking in with you as a leader to think about how am I passing on these messages. So some keywords: deliberate calm, bounded optimism. So not over the top, but bounded, saying we are going to get through this, as again, so many of you said. Pause, assess, anticipate, and act. I will share again very quickly that it's really interesting, and this has been true in our work too, that for many people, as they look back to their crisis and they think about a time in their work when they really felt connected, that they were really making a difference, often comes back to times of crisis. So it too shall pass, and it may be, and depending on how you're leading, it may be a really profound and transformational experience for many of your staff. Think about it from that perspective as well. I want to talk about competency in terms of leaders learn. And so this is really critical, is for us to really think about the evaluative mindset that we are working in, or that you need to foster as you think about this pandemic. So as a leader, part of our work is about thinking and self-reflecting and capturing what it is that you're learning for the moment and for the long term. So that's an essential competency of a leader. And so what we'd like to do is share two distinct tools. There are so many of them, but we offer two. And again, the links will be there for you. One of them is called the Right Now Survey. This is based on developmental evaluation work. So it is about learning along the way, understanding we've never been here, but we do want to capture what it is that worked and perhaps the stressors that we were facing in order for us to be able to learn past this. So the Right Now Survey is something that you might do with your teams when you meet. And you can use a tool like Polls Everywhere or capture the learnings in a PowerPoint. But it might be right now the greatest opportunities for success are. Capture that from your team. They might be seeing things that you're not even aware of. Right now, I am most concerned about. So what is it that they're concerned about? Are there things that perhaps you're not seeing as a leader that you need to be hearing so that you can try to problem solve those things? And then right now, I most need help with. What are some of those things? What are they maybe perhaps not saying unless given an opportunity to talk about that you need to be listening to? So that's in the short term. We offer that as a quick tool that you might be able to use regularly. The second tool is about the ongoing journaling that we invite you to think about. And I understand, of course, that many of you may not be able to do this. However, I'm also speaking to leaders who say, here's what I'm learning. Here's what I'm noticing. I wish I could write this. I wish I had a way of noting the things that I am becoming more aware of as I go through this crisis. And so what we're offering is a link where you can capture your learnings as a leader. And at the end of this, we can provide those back to you. If you're open to having those shared with your organization, we can also capture them at an organizational level so that you can capture the learnings of leaders and perhaps others, if you'd like to share the tool, about the learning that you're doing and what insights you're gaining as you go through this. And finally, if you're open to sharing them more collectively as sectors across sectors, we in kind will be gathering that information and looking at the themes that have come out from this developmental evaluation. So the questions there are, from your perspective, what is working well in terms of your organizational approach to address this pandemic? At this moment, what are you most concerned about? And what are you learning about the people you serve, the people you work with, the leadership at your organization in this crisis? And what about today do you want to capture? Highlight a thought, an insight. How are you feeling? And then anything else. So what we could offer, if you would like, is a reminder that comes once a week for you to be able to click on the link and enter your learnings. You can go in there as much or as little as you'd like. And after this, Kathleen will be sending out a email so that you can let us know whether you would find these tools helpful to you. So they will be available for you as well. So on that note, I'm going to now turn it over to Carrie to talk about Leaders Direct and Leaders Communicate. So I'm going to be turning my camera off, and I think Carrie's going to be turning hers on. So there's Carrie. Turn it over to you, Carrie.
Thanks very much, Maria, and thanks for everybody who is online and participating in this conversation. I'm just going to take a moment and make things a little bit brighter for you. So the next session we want to talk about is Leaders Direct. And if we can move to the slide that has the competencies we'll be talking about in that area. Leaders Direct, and we saw from your responses in this time of crisis, I'm going to be saying to you, leaders provide clear direction, and recognize that I'm saying that in a time when, as a leader, you may not have received clear direction yourself. But as much as you're feeling the challenges of getting different information at different times from different people, we know that teams and individuals on teams, the personal stressors that they're dealing with and the other types of stressors that Maria talked about, in this moment, quite often what they need is clear direction. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk about knowing when to apply different kinds of leadership, and that a competency of leaders at any time, but particularly in a crisis, is making effective decisions and judgments through crisis, which feels on the surface like a whole lot of pressure, but we're also going to talk about the fact that it's okay to change your decision. Quite often we need to make a decision in the moment that needs to be different a few moments later. So the next slide shares with you the framework of situational leadership, which comes from Hersey and Blanchard. We're going to discuss this later in the series a little bit further, but right now what we want to focus on is that you need to think about the situation at play that helps you define the quadrant that you're going to be working with. And that situation is both about the task and the individual and the circumstance. So circumstances that we're in right now really provide us two quadrants where most of our activity will be, and those are the bottom two quadrants, delegating and directing. You'll note that in the chart, it says these both have low supportive behaviors. And I want to be clear that we're not talking about the kinds of supportive behaviors that Maria has been talking about until now. This is about task support, how much task support you are providing people. So in a situation like the one we're in, there is little time often for task support. In many cases, there's little tolerance for error. And in some cases, in some less critical tasks, you may need to have more tolerance for error than you currently do. The chart on the right goes a little bit farther into this, and the top three sections of that chart, again, are many of the things that Maria has been talking about until now. The bottom two sections are where we land when we're talking about directing as leaders. So our responsibility as a leader in this time is to ensure compliance with the rules and regulations. And the rules and regulations are changing. You may have policy in place in your organization that no longer applies during this time. So when I use the term policy, when I use the term rules and regulations, it really is the right now policy, the right now decision that has been made and communicated, and making sure that people are following the direction that they've been given. You continue to have a responsibility for that. The other piece, the second piece on the bottom, is instilling a sense of accountability amongst all staff under your responsibility to follow those rules and procedures. So again, this comes from the UN project toolkit about leading in emergencies. Your standard operating procedures, whatever still applies, needs to still apply, and any new decisions are your new standard operating procedures for right now. So on the next slide, how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that in this crisis when there's so many different things coming at you and so much going on? We know that every leader often has a favored style or a couple of favorite styles. And something that you should always be thinking about is the most appropriate style for the situation. So crisis calls on us in different ways to exercise different muscles, perhaps. So this quadrant we were talking about called directing. Directing is an appropriate response for some activities in a crisis. There's a reason that the military uses command and control. Military is getting people prepared for times of crisis. so that people will know to immediately follow directions that they are given. When you're telling people exactly what to do, they're going to go ahead and do it, and it expects that you're going to hold them accountable if they don't. Directing is helpful for people who are uncertain about what they need to be doing, and recognizing that, as we saw in the poll, some of you are in a place where you are unsure about what you need to be doing, but you may need to make a decision and direct people and tell them to follow it. And they may need to be aware that that direction might change at a moment's notice. To have direction gives people a focused purpose of the moment, and it allows you as a leader to know that there are some things being looked after so that you can focus on other things. You can always circle back to people to have a more collaborative conversation later when the moment allows. The second piece that we have here, delegating, is the second quadrant that I pointed you to. This is for your people who know what to do, people who have the experience, people who have the motivation to do it. You know that you can delegate a task to them. You don't necessarily need to follow up. They will come and find you if they need you. So those are the two key quadrants that you want to be thinking about, perhaps practicing in a little bit differently than you normally do. Consensus and collaborative styles, which many of us lean towards, may need to shift a bit right now. So you simply may not have the time to build consensus on every matter. And this doesn't mean that you're not gathering people's input. It means that right now you're the decision maker. So it may be about saying, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm going to make the decision. We don't have time for consensus decision making right now. And again, you can always circle back as you need to. So as you're prioritizing your leadership work, think about how you hold people accountable in areas that are necessarily receiving less of your attention. So an example of this is sending a team of staff home to work. You may be directing them, go home and work on whatever you need to work on that's out there and available. But you might want to think about being slightly more directive to say, look at the work that you have plus these two new priorities, start a plan, and then check back with me on your plan so that I can review and approve it. That also gives you a natural check-in point with people on how they are doing. If you have people that you're directing regularly, giving people multiple tasks one after the other, you're sort of firing off emails at somebody, or you get on the phone and you give people a list of things to do, give them a sense of the priority of things at the same time. So in multiple emails that you're sending, you could say this one's high, this one's low, this one's medium, so that they can have that direction to organize themselves and feel confident that they're doing what it is that you need them to do. The next slide is about making decisions with incomplete information and under time constraints, which we are all doing right now. And again, inevitably, you may need to change that decision when new information comes in. So one thing that the UN directs us to do and think about in emergencies is be very clear for yourself and those that you work with what your limits of authority are. And think about whether limits of authority need to change because of the current situation. Do you need an expansion? Is there something that you would normally have to go to a leader to, but it just isn't possible at this point in time and you're going to have to decide it? There may also be times when your limits of authority need to contract right now. So something that you normally would make a decision on your own, you may need to check in on. It's important to know where those boundaries are and if those boundaries have changed right now. As Maria talked about, practicing self-compassion. You know that the information that you're working with is imperfect. You will make imperfect decisions. The quote that we have here, all good leaders have scars on their leadership mantle. It is a reality of this situation that you will need to change decisions on the fly. When new information comes available, you will need to make a decision the moment that you are completely confident in, but it has to be done. Do not concern yourself with needing to change a decision with new information, with needing to change a decision if you've had an opportunity to collaborate with people and find that there may be a different approach. Maria talked about pause, assess, anticipate, and act. So if you have the time to pause, be as exploratory as you can. As much as possible, seek the divergent opinions to inform your decisions. But again, where you can't, do that after the fact and change the decision if you need to. Remember that you are competent. Take that moment to recall other scenarios that might not be exactly the same as this. I'm not sure any of us have dealt with something exactly the same as this, but you have been successful in dealing with crisis situations in the past. You wouldn't be somebody who's being relied on to provide leadership to people if you hadn't. So when you're feeling that you don't know where to turn next, when you're feeling uncomfortable and a lack of confidence in your decisions, remember that you are a competent leader. It can be really challenging in the best of times to practice empathy versus impartiality and fairness. And again, right now can be even more challenging, and right now is perhaps even more important. So empathy is key, but recognizing that stress may be making people act out of character. So you're providing empathy to people, and you are also making sure that you're applying your rules, you're applying your decisions in an impartial and fair way. One of the suggestions when you're talking to somebody and you're feeling quite empathetic about what it is that they're talking about, you're hearing them, you know that they have a significant challenge, but in order to be impartial and fair, you can't respond to them the way that they wish to be responded to, is perhaps consider saying, I hear you and then follow up with the decision, the rule, and explaining why it needs to be done, rather than I hear you but. So you're just confirming that you've heard what they've said. You're confirming that the fact that you have to apply the rules doesn't mean that you are not empathetic to what it is that you're talking to about. And if you can, if a decision is too impactful or you just have too little information to make under the time pressure, consider if you can create or force a pause. Don't hesitate where you can to reconvene a meeting. Don't hesitate where you can to say, I'm going to have to call you back in 15 minutes with the answer to this. And if you can't, then you can frame your response in, right now, I need to tell you to do this. I may call you back in 15 minutes with a change to that for the next time this comes up, or a formal decision will come later today. But wherever you can, find the ways to pause and make sure that you are gathering the information, seeking the divergent opinions. We're going to move on and talk about Leaders Communicate, which some of what I've just talked about, we've touched on a little bit already. So the competencies for leaders communicating in times of crisis are communicating clearly, communicating often, communicating very specifically, and being transparent and honest. And what I want to say here again on the next slide is your communication does not have to be perfect. It needs to be good enough, which is perfect for right now. So don't become paralyzed by trying to create the perfect communication. I myself have an example of an organization that I'm working with right now that I had a draft email that I was going to send at noon, and then new information came in at 11:30, so I worked on it some more, and then I was going to send it at 2, and then I was waiting for something else. And there's a moment where you just have to hit the button, send the information you have, and sign off with a stay tuned for more. It's tough sometimes not to become paralyzed trying to be perfect in what you're saying. And I think everybody recognizes and realizes and appreciates right now that sometimes you simply can't, that more information needs to come. From a clarity, I think I have many examples of policies, of communications that use words that leave room for interpretation. So a really simple example of that is if you say, staff may, you are giving them the opportunity to make a decision. If you say staff will, then you're being very clear that that's what everyone will do. So do take a moment and think about those words, those modification words that you want to be very, very clear about whether you're giving them an option or whether you're not giving them an option. Communicate often. If you're the lead of a team that's all working virtually, that you might not normally do a weekly check-in, but now you need to do a weekly check-in. Recognizing there's technology challenges, there's phone lines being overloaded, webinar lines being overloaded. Your organizational webinar account maybe need to be kept for more critical activities. Look into things like there are free personal Zoom accounts, and Zoom is PHIPAA compliant, that you can get. So think about, are there different ways? If you're a leader who's stuck in meetings all day, stuck on the phone all day, you're not able to get out in the field as you normally would. Your entire team may be at the office, but social distancing and trying to stay away from each other. We're all relying more on phone and email to connect. don't overwhelm people, obviously, but also don't think they've got more important things to do than read this from me. You are their leader. Your communication will stand out. Your empathy, your direction is what they're looking for. Be specific. This is something that we all try to practice all the time, but again, in crisis, it's even more important. Understand who's sending out an email post phone call with the specific action items. End the call with the recap of action items. Ensure that the action items in your team email stand out. So bold them, italicize them, underscore them. Don't get the very specific things that you need people to do. Don't let them get lost, or don't have to circle back and talk about them again just because they haven't been captured. And transparency and honesty, whatever you do, don't make promises that you can't keep. Be very clear about what you can share and what you can't. Remember what Maria was talking about, deliberate, calm, and bounded optimism in your communication. So our next slide, I'm not going to go through each of the tips here, but what we've provided is a few examples of things that you might be thinking of putting in an email and a different way of saying it. That again, this very first one, instead of saying there will be no layoffs, again, don't make any promises that you don't know that you can keep in such a turbulent time. So you're going to say something about the priority of the future stability of our organization and our people. One of the mistakes I made early on with an organization that I'm supporting is sending an email out that said, for the next 2 weeks, we will. And then all of a sudden, there was a whole bunch of decisions to be made again, or at least communicated again at the end of 2 weeks. So I've changed my language to, until further notice, we will. Or if necessary, we'll revisit the decision in 2 weeks, or as soon as new information comes available. Until you hear any different, carry on like this. Don't make more work for yourself by setting deadlines that you don't need to set. So again, don't commit to something that's out of your control. Try not to speak in absolutes. And the bottom one is the last one I'm going to mention before I hand it back to Maria. And it goes back to the self-compassion. It goes back to the coping skills, looking after yourselves as leaders. Try not to send out an email or communicate to people that you as an individual are here 24/7 until this is over. You hopefully have a leadership team in the organization. If you don't, if you're a very small organization, you may need to think about who else in the organization can be there to support you. Have you made an on-call schedule? You may very well, if you are the key leader in the organization, be available 24/7, but make yourself a tier 2 support some of the time. Who's the first person they call? And perhaps it's not you. If you don't set up an appropriate sharing of the leadership workload, you will not be able to finish this marathon. And indeed, it is a marathon. Thank you, and I will hand it back to Maria.
Thanks very much, Carrie. We are almost out of time. We hope that you have found this information helpful. I do want to talk a little bit about next steps and then end with a checkout. So in terms of follow-up to this webinar, given that some people were not able to make the webinar from what we hear, we will likely be presenting the webinar again. So if you know of people in your organizations that may benefit from it, it will be available. This was a in-kind webinar that we added to the regular series. So we will try to make that available. In addition to that, you will be receiving an email following the webinar that will provide us feedback on how we did and if there's any ways in which we can improve our webinar. A link to the developmental evaluation and the reflective practice that we talked about if you are interested in journaling and logging your stories. That tool is available, and again, we will be able to provide that information back to you as you require it. And then a link and password to the portal with which will have the recorded webinar, the PowerPoint, and other resources so that you can use them as you would like with your team. So on that note, we would just like to check out, to have an opportunity to hear from you how you're leaving this hour that we had together. So it will go back to the polls sheet that you have. And this is just 1 or 2 words. If you're using 2 words, I'll invite you to use a hyphen between the words so that we capture it. And so let me just get that open. And as that is going up, so how are you leaving as we finish our session together? Type 1 or 2 words. And on the note, I will say thank you very much for joining us. Any feedback that you have, please provide to us. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. We will also send information on the upcoming webinars that continue our series.